Now, once the paperwork is done, the NYPD is going to fly the murder suspect from Pennsylvania to New York, where he would be booked and photographed. Mangione would then be arraigned in the afternoon, or it could happen tomorrow. The Manhattan District Attorney announced Mangione had been indicted on first-degree murder in furtherance of terrorism. Mangione could also face federal charges out of the Southern District of New York. Now, federal charges could make Mangione eligible for the death penalty. Here to discuss, criminal defense and civil attorney John Phillips is with us, and criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Matthew Tempanik. Thank you so much for being on with us this morning. John, let me start with you. What can we expect today in Pennsylvania?
We're going to start moving on this case. So, you know, Pennsylvania has jurisdiction, obviously, because that's where he was picked up. That's where he was found with the gun, and the McDonald's, employees identified him. So, there's certainly charges there, but the meat of the potato, as you just discussed, comes from what's going to happen in New York, and then the potential addition of federal charges. So, this is just kind of the start of the dominoes starting to fall for Mr. Mangione's criminal court life.
Yeah, and Matthew, the difference, I mentioned incorrectly that the death penalty might be on the table. Life without parole is the max that he would potentially be getting there in New York. But talk about the state charges that he has in Pennsylvania, because they captured him there. He does have, and we can take a look at the actual charges that he's facing there in Pennsylvania, where he is going to be dealing with the tampering with possession of instruments, tampering with records of identification, forgery, false identification to law enforcement, possessing those instruments of a crime. What happens to those charges once he goes to New York for what no doubt is considered the much more heinous crime?
So what's most likely going to happen is those charges are going to be adjudicated at the same time as the murder charges. Pennsylvania knows these are all relatively low-level felonies. However, they are still kind of like they are still charges that if he were to be acquitted of something, not saying he would be in New York, they could come back and charge him and or convict him and hold him on these charges in Pennsylvania. So I think the most likely situation is he'll get a public defender in Pennsylvania. Those charges will be treated. But I definitely think they're going to see within cases before doing anything final in the case.
So we are anticipating, we know there's not going to be any cameras inside of that courtroom, so we won't get to see anything. But John Phillips, his attorney, Karen Agnifilo, great attorney, comes with a lot of accolades. She was a longtime chief district attorney there in New York. She knows that courtroom, that courthouse, those judges, they know her. What's it look like when you get a client like this, and now he's back in New York, and the process begins?
The thing you want in a case like this is to hire a lawyer, really from the locality, but somebody that's not going to be surprised or kind of fall in love with themselves on a TV camera, right? And a lawyer like that has been through it. They understand that the more important thing today is the criminal defense rights and the constitutional rights of my client, not press conferences and press statements, because sometimes people trip over themselves the first time they get a high-profile client. And the better news, and we talked about it last week, is it's not Kim Kardashian, right? So Twitter and X wanted Kim Kardashian on the case, and no, she's not licensed to practice, but the attorney he chose certainly is.
Yeah, that has been the headline, but she passed a baby bar, not the full bar. That would have only been in California. But let's talk more about Karen Agnifilo. She did put out a statement. She hasn't done anything public, to your point, John, not getting in front of the cameras at this point, taking that time to speak to her client. She said that the federal government's reported decision to pile on top of an already overcharged first-degree murder and state terror case is highly unusual and raises serious constitutional and statutory double jeopardy concerns. We are ready to fight these charges in whatever court they are brought. What's the order of things, Matthew? What would go first?
Remember, under the Supremacy Clause, federal law trumps state law. So remember, they also have concurrent jurisdiction. So the feds can also charge first-degree murder as well as the state does. Terrorism charges are primarily federal charges. So I hear what she's saying about her statement, because terrorism would probably be something the Southern District of New York would be handling. I think what's going to happen is the feds are going to see how the evidence plays out. They're going to wait and see how the media plays out in this case, because you need to understand this. The feds don't want to take cases they could potentially lose. And the outpouring support, shocking as it may be, for somebody who allegedly executed a CEO, an innocent bystander, at the beginning of the morning, is something that 41% of adults 18 to 29 agree or somewhat agree with. So I think the feds are going to sit back and wait and see how the case proceeds before deciding whether or not they want to charge him in federal court.
And John Phillips, I know you're no stranger to high-profile cases. You've had high-profile clients before. You mentioned he's not exactly high-profile in terms of celebrity, but this is a high-profile case at this point. Can you talk about how he may be treated differently once he gets to New York, if it has to do with how he's incarcerated or just how the court will take into consideration the extensive amount of attention on this case?
This is a different one, right? And as Matthew was saying about, 41% approval rate, normally murderers don't have that when they walk into a jail cell, like when Joe Exotic, who I represent, walks into a new prison because they're transferring him. He's a celebrity, right? People have come from seeing him on Tiger King. This isn't exactly your traditional celebrity. And if he did this, he's a cold-blooded murderer. Again, the state's got to prove its case. The feds have to prove its case. But it's going to be interesting to see when he's in with hard and fast, fellow inmates in New York, how he's treated, because, generally, somebody like him could pray victim to the very harsh circumstances going from a family of wealth to a bunch of people that really don't care about your self-interest in jail.
Anna, you mentioned that family of wealth and what is backing this particular defendant. We are going to talk about that on the other side. So Matthew and John, stand by as Luigi Mangione prepares to face a judge later today. This is a live look outside of that Blair County Courthouse in Pennsylvania, where there's going to be a hearing over his extradition to New York for the accusation that he is the one who killed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. And we're also looking at the money moves in this case and whether that will be in his favor. There's a Give, Send, Go fundraiser page that we're learning about that was created to help aid Mangione's defense. And it has now reached over $150,000. This campaign was formed by the December 4th legal community. They had set a goal of $500,000 to send directly to Mangione if he chose to accept it. Now, the organizers write in part, "We are not here to celebrate violence, but we do believe in the constitutional right of fair legal representation." The organizers' spokesperson had this to say about critics while speaking to CNN.
And I think for every person who might be, exhibiting some sense of joy, there are 10 people sort of asking the question, well, who's the real murderer in this conversation? We're talking about the largest and most successful private health insurance corporation in the history of humankind, right? Which is successful precisely because they generate profits by denying claims, among other things.
Now, other crowdfunding sites accepting donations for Mangione's defense, such as GoFundMe, have been taken down. This morning, we are asking, should supporters be allowed to fund this defense? Let's bring in our panel to answer that question. Criminal defense and civil attorney John Phillips is with us. And also joining the conversation, retired FBI special agent Jennifer Koffendorfer is with us. Jennifer, let me start with you. What's your reaction when you see that people are happy to give money to someone who is accused of being an assassin?
Well, quite frankly, in this case, it's absolutely ridiculous. First of all, his family is worth around $100 million. They have plenty of money. They don't need this. To me, this is just absolutely grandstanding behind his name. If you look at the people involved in this, where was their stance on healthcare prior to this? It didn't exist. And what's going to happen to that money? Because I don't think it's going to Luigi Mangione. He has plenty on his own. So to me, it's just a ploy and ridiculous.
It's a good point. We don't know exactly. There's really no way to know for sure sometimes with these crowdfunding sources how the money is going to be given to the person. But John Phillips, it's not the first time we've seen a legal defense being raised by the public. What comes to mind most recently, Kyle Rittenhouse made a lot of headlines over getting a lot of money that impacted bond and impacted things in his case because he had so much money that people were donating. George Zimmerman many years ago, people were supporting financially. Your thoughts on whether or not supporters should be allowed to fund a accused criminal's defense?
Right. And I've used these. I've used these in many cases. I've used them in my litigation against the Trump administration where, there's extreme, wealth and power on one side, but you have clients that don't have it on the other side. And with Mangione, we don't know how much his family is going to contribute or donate or whether this clause in the grandmother's, will, if you commit a crime, you may not get family inheritance. How that works. But GoFundMe as a business, so this is kind of how you spend money and how you speak is First Amendment, right? But GoFundMe and these other entities are private individuals, private companies. They don't have to abide by that. And I know in raising money on Joe Exotic's case, we couldn't raise any money related to his criminal defense. That is their policy. They're strict about it. They'll shut it down. But if you're raising money for healthcare, you're raising money for other causes. We made it to pay Carol Baskin back at the time. They do allow it. But there's these other, resources because, look, some of the people setting these things up are good people and altruistic. Some are looking for their own secondary gain and their own political messaging. I think this happens to be the latter.
You mentioned the family. So let's talk about the fact that what we have learned about the background of Luigi Mangione is that he comes from a very wealthy background. And according to Fox News, the grandmother of the killer the accused killer reportedly left millions to her children and grandchildren after she died, with one condition in this trust that any grandchild receiving an inheritance from her could not be charged or indicted or convicted if they were convicted of a crime or pleaded guilty to a felony. But it also says indicted there. And again, according to Fox News, Mary Mangione left roughly $30 million behind with those guidelines. So that includes a physically violent act, a violent act against another person or property, or any drug-related felony. So we're wondering, will his family be funding Luigi's defense? And Jennifer, we've heard from the family that they are shocked. They cannot believe that this has happened. They've asked for the prayers. They've said that they are praying and their thoughts are with the victim's family, Brian Thompson. Your thoughts on whether or not his family is going to be front and center, which we sometimes see even in cases like this?
Well, I think it's very clear they're funding him. He had a retained counsel straight away for the Pennsylvania case. He has one of the highest dollar attorneys that there is in New York, and she's good. And, that was retained before any of this money was collected. Look, they paid for him $40,000 a year to go to prep school. They paid $80,000, $90,000 plus to go to an Ivy League school. I think they're going to financially support him. In fact, we see it already. So I don't think he's going to be for want of anything, and he never has.
John, I'm reminded of being in a Pennsylvania courtroom waiting for an extradition hearing for Brian Kohberger in the Idaho student murders. And he was there for the first time being named as a suspect. And I watched an entire row of his family there, really standing in solidarity with him. They had to have been blindsided by this. The media had been, attention had been just immense in the days leading up to that hearing. But we were all learning this name, and they were there mouthing, I love you to him. What's it like for families when you have a family member whose face has been splashed everywhere for a really heinous crime?
Julia, it's awful. I sat in a courtroom a couple of weeks ago where on one side was an entire family of a 18-year-old boy, essentially, who stabbed his girlfriend repeatedly to the point of paralysis. And on the other side was her family and supporters. And one side had more righteousness on their side, but that doesn't take away the loss. When somebody's essentially sentenced for life or facing a life sentence, that this is somebody they grew up with. They saw the good side of him, and it's tragic. Many judges, when they're doing sentencing, will say, well, there's no winners in this courtroom today. And certainly there's going to be people that turn their back that was in his family. And there's going to be people that, pay his bills and, $40,000, $100,000, $200,000 for legal fees when you've got wealth of, 7, 8, 9 figures is kind of small, relatively speaking. But, again, it goes back to the ultimate issue in this case, which is, one, healthcare is abysmal. But what you usually see is people with the assets of the Mangione family having better options. But yet here we have somebody who, took life in his own hands in retaliation, as alleged. And it's I think it's why we're all fascinated.
Jennifer, let me ask you this as a follow-up. Are you surprised that someone who does come from the means he does, which sometimes we see people get a lot of support when people know that they won't be able to pay, they won't be able to have access to the resources, but it's been pretty clear in reporting that he does have this family background. Are you surprised that people are rallying around him the way they are financially?
Well, I think it's the ideology that's been exposed that they're rallying behind, actually. And then when you look at the face of this, this is a handsome young kid. He's charismatic in what we've seen on social media and so forth. He's certainly very photogenic. And so I think he is very easy to rally around in that regard when you really don't look at the fact that he cowardice shot somebody in their back.
This is a man accused of murder and on top of that, terroristic murder, according to the New York District Attorney. We are going to have to take our break, but John Phillips, Jennifer Coffendorfer, thank you so much for weighing in on this case.